Welcome everyone. Welcome to the first meeting of this new webinar series, Corruption Off Script. I know the majority of you from the previous series on corruption measurement, and I'm very happy to see you all also on board for this new effort, exercise, project. I don't know how to call it. I just knew that I was coming across some very interesting and illuminating papers and studies, and I wanted to be able to dedicate some time to have a discussion about them with their authors and to highlight very impressive work being done on a variety of topics outside of just corruption measurement. And with that in mind, I reached out to Kristina Weißmüller and I discussed this, and thankfully she didn't think that I was too far off in this idea, and so here we are. Before I properly welcome her and invite her to start talking to us about today's topic, just a quick reminder of how the meeting will be structured. Compared to the corruption measuring roundtable, we have only allocated 6 minutes to this meeting, so it will be a little shorter, more to the point. If you have any questions or comments about Kristina's slides or about the point that she is discussing, please do feel free to raise your hand or message there in the chat so I can interrupt her and we can talk about that specific point. So let's try to make it as conversational as possible. Again, if you would like to know more about any specific point, feel free to ask about it. Otherwise, I'm going to ask everyone to please keep your microphones off. Again, unless I invite you to ask the question or make the comment. And that's pretty much it. Well, I guess I should have also introduced myself for those who will be watching this on YouTube later on. My name is Joseph Poche Alvarez. I'm associate professor at the University of Osaka, and I'm very delighted again to be hosting Kristina Weißmüller, who will be talking to us about the psychology of corruption, based on a very recent publication on the topic, looking at the decision making of public officials. And Kristina will also be addressing other projects on that topic that she's cooking right now. So again, we only have 6 minutes. So Kristina, the floor is yours. Please, if you could also start by telling us a little bit about yourself, and feel free to start sharing your screen whenever you're ready.
All right. Sorry, sharing. I hope that you can see my screen now.
Yes, perfect.
All right. Thank you so much, Joseph, for this very kind introduction. I'm very excited to be here in the new kickoff of this webinar series. My name is Kristina Weißmüller, and as Joseph just mentioned, I'm going to talk about the psychology of administrative corruption today, mostly focused on one of my recent publications just out in the beginning of this year, called A Demand Resource Model of Corruptibility. This study was published in ROPA, and it presents empirical evidence on how moral disengagement and harm awareness regulate civil servants' moral judgment. I'm a tenured assistant professor at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and this study still originates back from my postdoc phase, which I did at the KPM Institute for Public Management at the University of Bern, together with Adrian Ritz. So it's a co-authored study. I would like to start with just a little bit, even though I do see some familiar faces here, about myself, so you know from which perspective I came to this research and what inspires my approach to anti-corruption and corruption research, mainly focused on the public sector. And that is, so as I mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of public administration, but I do have a business background. So before joining academia, I worked as an industrial engineer in different management firms, industrial firms internationally. So I come from a kind of managerial approach. I do think that leadership and motivation matters. And if we want to find out what drives integrity or breaches of integrity, we need to have a bit more of an all-encompassing approach. So my specialty is public management. I also do a bit of anti-corruption research, risk governance research, now also informed by recent technology developments such as AI. And lots of my work is focused on comparing also across different boundaries of institutions, administrative systems, and so on. So for a couple of years now, I've been involved in the public management community. I'm also board member of IRSPM, the International Research Society of Public Management, where I'm mostly standing for this lens of a behavioral approach to public administration. And that means that we look into the psychology of what drives motivation, leadership practices, how behavior is the outcome of multiple factors, not just institutions or contexts, and not only traits or statuses that people are finding themselves in due to work conditions, but it's more of an all-encompassing approach. And you can read more about my work, for instance, also for United Nations, and also the various research projects that I'm currently leading on particularly anti-corruption and corruption research on my webpage. So, and thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited, and thank you for taking the time. So, as I mentioned, the study that I'm going to present today is called A Demand Resource Model of Corruptibility. It's a quantitative study conducted in Switzerland, which is already an interesting case for corruption research because it's also, often regarded as a low corruption country. If we just look at the Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International, for instance, Switzerland regularly scores very well on this metric. People are not normally in everyday life confronted with having to pay bribes to receive public services. So it's a kind of a clean scope. So corruption research there is still a little bit rare. And we had the opportunity, we meaning myself and Adrian Ritz, to conduct research with active civil servants and trying to figure out what drives their motivation to, well, being able to be swayed to engage in corrupt acts. This study was recently published in the Review of Public Personal Administration, ROPA, and it is just out right now, and you can find it open access. So let's dive right in. Come on. That way. Maybe it's important to start with a definition of administrative corruption. Administrative corruption is in contrast to concepts like petty corruption or need-based corruption, concepts that were developed by Monika Bauer, for instance. It's more of a contextual idea. So the focus of this study and most of my research is what people do and experience when interacting with state institutions. This can be from the perspective of the citizens, or it can be, like in this study, from the perspective of civil servants. So with administrative corruption, we mean we have a context of service provision. It can be interacting with administration, being in an official office, so you have a mandate and therefore should be accountable, and the degree to which people in these mandates abuse this power. So this study is not about needs-based corruption where citizens are forced to pay bribes to just receive services, but we're taking the perspective of the civil servants themselves, who, keep in mind, in a country like Switzerland, where there is a high degree of professionalization, high degree of public service motivation, you know, the feeling of like you're a good civil servant. You're not joining the public administration in Switzerland to extract funds normally. It's also a high wage country, well developed, scores very highly on lots of development indices. So there's not the need to join administration to extract funds, you would think. But what we also have to keep in mind that administrative corruption still exists. And Switzerland, unfortunately, has been revealed to be abused for different forms of fraud. Large-scale procurement fraud scandals have shaken the country. It has been going through the media. For instance, we had a big case on IT fraud in a ministry where thousands and millions of francs were extracted for no good reason. When caught and then asked in courts why the people were engaging in extracting public funds for private gain, they just said, well, there was an opportunity and they didn't really care. And that's interesting, right? We often associate corruption as a problem more prevalent in developing countries, but it's not the case. We can find different forms of administrative corruption throughout all countries. 40% of all bribes in the world are paid to extract procurement money, taxpayers' money, and this is why we really need to focus on understanding this phenomenon better. Now, you would think in a country like Switzerland, where we have a lot of regulation, we do have also laws specifically mentioning bribery and the abuse of office for private gain as a crime. Still, all of these meters and meters of legal regulation, of explicit compliance standards, do not effectively prevent corruption cases. So why is that the case? I argue that current standards of compliance trainings, integrity trainings, often neglect very basic functions of psychology. We do sometimes think, informed by rational choice, that people just need to know what they should do and then they will do it. But from our own experience and from empirical research, we know maybe that's not the case. People are biased. People are affected by the states that they're in, how they feel, how they perceive their work environment, how they perceive fairness, how they perceive stress. They can be burned out, and then maybe they don't care so much about the public values they should uphold. And this is basically my approach, looking at what is the psychology of integrity violations and how does the moral justification to engage in corruption emerge. Joseph, you have a question?
Yes. So because I know that you're going to go very soon into the specific model and the variable that you focus on, I would like to invite you to maybe take a step back in terms of this study of administrative corruption, right? From an academic perspective, which I know that some of it doesn't always necessarily translate immediately to policy making. But something that has been really like going around my head for a number of years is this intersection of different areas of academic study, which your paper seems to connect very well with. But I wonder how you see it. So on the one hand, we have the study of administrative corruption, right? Which is, there's ample antecedents in the study of corruption or anti-corruption studies, or whichever way we wish to call it. On the other hand, we also have the field of administrative ethics that have been discussing about compliance and integrity training and the softer or hard approaches to administrative ethics for a number of decades, even longer than the study of corruption itself. Yes. And then we also have a lot of very interesting progress done in the psychology of ethical behavior, modeling it from the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, right? And it comes to mind the models of Trevino and Rest and Jones and others, yes? So I'm genuinely curious about where these different areas of study fit within, in connection to one another, and how so now you apply this study to the specific case of Swiss bureaucrats. Do you borrow more from one, like how do you connect these usually or historically disconnected areas of study?
Thank you for this question. I agree that this is basically also one of the key issues in why we are still struggling to find effective anti-corruption strategies that work in practice. Namely, we have, if you look at the literature, and it's a rich literature, the integrity discourse, the compliance discourse, and what even is corruption as a phenomenon has been explored for multiple decades now from different lenses, be it economic, more socially constructed, and so forth. And I personally, currently I work a lot on anti-corruption strategy effectiveness. So trying to bridge the, regulation gap to the implementation gap and finding out, what actually then changes behavior, which is a bit challenging, because how do we even measure a reduction in corruption? Because people who are more skilled and trained, they will also be more likely to speak up, blow the whistle, or be less tolerant of other colleagues engaging in acts of corruption. So it's a bit of a measurement issue as well. On the other hand, I find the psychology of ethical behavior fantastically interesting. And it's a very rich discourse. For instance, also, if you just look at like specific sub categories like very simple questions are, for instance, the gendered aspects of corruption. We have the fair sex hypothesis, where if you only look at behavioral psychology studies, you all like lab experiments, for instance, you will often find that the mainstream discourse supports the idea that women are less corrupt than men. However, once you take into account context and societal factors, looking at what would be long-term outcomes of this, then these clear-cut differences evaporate. So what I do in my study, and then basically the umbrella is administration as a citizen-state interaction context, I kind of try to chip away these latent factors that we've not taken into account well enough yet. So the psychology is the foundation. People are people, and that is also, I think, interesting and why we should research the psychology of corruption. But we need to take into account the broader organizational context and also institutional context. Well, then, but on the other hand, changing institutions is hard. But what we can do is we can try to understand the psychology that combines all of us, irrespective of what cultures we are working in, how we are socialized. The basic factors of what drives corruption or corruptibility, they're quite similar across humans. But then we, having found this foundation, we can then try to make sometimes very, very simple strategies within organizations, and from then on trying to solve the problem step by step, because changing the quality of institutions, which clearly makes a difference on the corruptibility of people, that's a very long-term process that needs a lot of political will, that also needs a lot of funds. You can't change that from one day to the other, but you do have management tools that you can use in your team, and then in your department, and then in your organization. So it's a kind of a practical approach that I try to develop further to help theory and practice.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm sure that I will continue pressing you for some details about that approach later on, but please go ahead.
Sure. Okay, I'll continue. Thank you. All right. Having come from this like more background idea, and also like giving you a prime of the context of Switzerland, even though we'll come back to this later, and some of this I've already mentioned. So I come from a very basic idea of what is corruption. You can think about corruption as the abuse of public office for private gain, very broadly defined. Gain can be utility, it can be for yourself, it can be for others, it can be something you like, it can be monetary or otherwise. And a very simple definition is that corruption is the outcome of some kind of power monopoly, the ability to withhold public services, for instance, or have power over it without oversight, and a lot of discretion in this. And administration today still has a lot of discretion, even though we're very digitized in developed countries, and the absence of accountability. This is also why more contemporary definitions often put accountability deficit at the center of what constitutes corruption, especially if you look at like political philosophy of corruption. As I mentioned, we do find that some kind of top-down regulatory approaches to anti-corruption often is rather ineffective or hard to measure. And there's various approaches. Joseph just mentioned in the integrity versus compliance discourse. There's a very nice paper about this by the colleagues around Perlman, for instance, who kind of systematically shows, well, we kind of need both. You need to make clear rules, but also motivate people and find the intrinsic motivation to make people understand intrinsically why it's a bad idea to engage in corruption. So my approach is kind of a mix of both, and this is under the norm of behavioral approach to public sector corruption, anti-corruption. And as I just mentioned, the very basic idea is there's a human factor in all of this. Besides all the institutions that guide us, or the logics that we learn, the practices that we emulate from our colleagues in our work life, there is a certain plasticity and universality in how the human mind works. And humans do try to make sense of their behavior. 99% of us, we want to be good people. We want to be able to work in a way and make decisions in a way that we can still look into the mirror on the next day. So I'm trying in this study to understand the link between psychological, individual, and work-related situational factors on integrity outcomes. So the research question of the demands resource model study is, how do integrity draining demands and integrity enhancing resources affect civil servants' corruptibility, and how do moral disengagement and harm awareness regulate this psychological process? It's actually, again, based on larger studies, larger overview studies that have mapped these micro foundations of administrative corruption. I think we're all aware there's multiple factors in the reddish box is institutions, the whole institutional discourse. And this is a study, or it's a picture taken from a systematic review on these micro foundations that drive the sense-making process. So coming from the left side, every one of us starts with some background. We have awareness and individual factors that may play into how corruptible we are, how likely we are to just accept corruption as something to do. Then all of us, and also civil servants, hold behavioral beliefs, normative beliefs, and control beliefs. Are we kind of forced, or do we feel forced to comply with integrity violating behavior because everyone does it? Or do we have very strong normative and value propositions that we have internalized that guide us? Do we have pro-social motivation that drives our job? And this prior research shows that moral justification is the key. It's a very simple idea, right? So we have kind of a process model from all of these different background factors that drive our reasoning. And then we come to a explicit or implicit moral justification for our behavior, which then leads to corruption or not engaging in corruption. Context and institutions may moderate this. And this prior study on the micro foundations, the systematic review, also shows that there are significant intention moderators. And stress is one of them, feeling potentially burned out or having unclear guidance about what is morally acceptable, but also our attitudes, our pro-social motivation, our public service motivation, which is a very specific type of motivation found in civil service, really drives this behavior. And trying to link these meta findings with what actually happens on the ground, I use a novel way of conceptualizing corruptibility, and that is based on the so-called job demands resource model. Joseph.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add one point to your previous slide. For those in attendance who are not that familiar with the psychology of corruption studies. So if I'm not mistaken, the model, of course, borrows from the theory of planned behavior, right? Which is one of those core models in social psychology as well, that have been empirically retested over and over again for the last 40 years, very well supported. In the study, in the area of corruption study, however, it has been adopted a couple of times, but not really built upon it, right? So I really like what you've done here, if you don't mind me saying, how you basically synthesize so much literature that we have in the study of corruption and kind of like put it together in order, right? Because normally we just find like one factor, a couple of factors at a time, but in reality we're looking at the complexity of the human mind, and we need to structure it as such. So I just wanted to bring attention as well to that aspect of your work.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed. This is one of my studies, and I want to highlight I did it together with one of my student assistants, Anna Zuber, who did fantastic work as well in this. And yes, these micro foundations are only concerned with what we know and what we don't know about administrative corruption done by civil servants. So keep in mind, I'm only looking on this side right now. And it's a very basic process model that we're now going to kind of disentangle a little bit more, building on this overview by integrating also a very basic model of how people perform at work. And this is the generalized job demands resource model by Demeruti and Backe. They've been working on the job demands resource model for over 20 years. And in essence, it posits that people at work are strained by demands, which can be organizational, they can be related to the job, by their personal life, by their home situation. And this either helps, if they have a good situation, these are resources. And then they increase motivation, they lead to more energy and health at work, and basically good performance, good outcomes in whatever aspects. It can also be just working quicker, working faster, working more motivated. But if these demands are hindering, they can drain motivation and they can take away our ability to uphold also good ethical standards at work. So I'm using this very generalized model about what drives people's performance in a work context and link it with this trade versus state debate in corruption research. We've had some studies about this by Ripoll and Bro and Christian Hauser, where you can basically also translate the idea of corruptibility, this potential of how resistant people are regarding bribe approaches or taking influence by other people who want to exploit the public office, by mapping individual factors plus work-related factors and psychological regulation. This is what is here in the middle. So we are not just determined by these demands and resources in a linear, strict way, but it matters how our leaders, how our team members, how our family is supporting us, how our organization is helping us sustain the resources and level the demands. So this is the idea of this paper, basically, and it's a big contribution showing that this is an interactive, process-based idea of corruptibility. Of course, I cannot include all potential factors at once, so I had to make a bit of a decision to come up with a demands resources model of corruptibility in the public sector. And I focus on two particularly prevalent draining demands. One is job-related burnout, that is exhaustion, cynicism, lower efficacy, and having stress. Even though we have some negative stereotypes about the public sector, they actually work very hard. It's not easy to work in the public sector, and it's not always very thankful, and you have to really take care to do a good job because it affects people's lives directly. It's not just about money. And then there's a quite extensive discourse on integrity or the lack of related to personality traits. So these demands either are state, so are people in the state of burnout, or do they also bring some kind of the dark triad with them? That's narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. And that's important because there's quite some research showing that leaders have a higher tendency to have these dark traits, and then this would basically also drive out integrity. Next, we have the integrity enhancing resources, and looking at the civil service, we have public service motivation, which is a well-established specific motivational or even identity-defining trait of people who self-select into public service because they want to basically self-sacrifice, have compassion, work hard, engage in policy making, help others. It's a whole mix of motivations, as well as a very generalized social value orientation based on studies by Ballier that is also personality related. Basically, the question, do people care about sharing with others, or are they a bit more selfish in the economic sense? And lastly, we have behavioral regulators. That is, first of all, are people even still caring about integrity, moral disengagement? Do they still are they still involved in making good decisions, or do they not care anymore? And are they actually aware of what engaging corruption could potentially entail? So that's the harm awareness. All in all, coming up with 8 hypotheses for this. And this is then our kind of simplified job demands resource model of corruptibility. So we have job-related burnout, the dark triads, which are integrity draining, and public service motivation and social value orientation as enhancing resources, regulated by whether people are morally engaged and aware of harm. This is the overview of the hypothesis. So, of course, the idea is that the regulation of moral disengagement and harm awareness is some kind of moderating effect. So, let's look at the method. A quasi-experimental vignette study was conducted with 260 Swiss civil servants. This sample is representative of the active civil servants in Switzerland. It was a convenient sample. People were incentivized by us donating a small amount of money to a charity for if they completed the survey. It was conducted with Qualtrics, and I used 3 randomized vignette treatments to provide a little bit of flavor in this data. Namely, if I just ask for one type of corruption, imagine you are a civil servant, someone comes to you and wants to give you a bribe, it's very easy to introduce measurement errors. So in order to create a bit of variance in this data set, people randomly received vignette treatments modeled after the white, gray, and black shades of Heidenheimer's corruption spectrum. And using vignettes is also very good to circumvent social desirability issues in corruption research. Just imagine if someone asks you, hey, have you been bribed recently? People will always say no. But if you give them some kind of a scenario, you circumvent this, giving people a little bit of a mental crutch, and people will still give you a realistic answer. And in this case, people were asked either to waive an inspection, a low harm scenario, this is the white corruption treatment, or the degree to which they would be willing, when being on a work trip, to take advantage, where the harm is not societal, it's not very large, but it's also definitely not in alignment of the regulation that you have. There's using a sports car, using perks. And the third scenario was black corruption, blatant bribery for withholding testimony in a whistleblowing case. And people received 2 out of 3 vignettes. The dependent variable is taken from Devale et al. About bribery in public sector. It's a 4-item construct asking how likely would people be to accept this type of bribe, how justified would it feel, how would it feel emotionally, and would it be a mistake? In addition, also harm awareness and realism was measured. For the different independent variables, of course, we measured all the ones I mentioned with pre-validated multi-item scales. And of course, the questionnaire was anonymized. So besides several controls, plausibility and attention checks were conducted, and also the construct validity of these measures is all good. You can read all of this in an extensive appendix together with the paper. The data is representative, which is important. So we actually have not an over representation of people who are over motivated, for instance. So we really have people who are also not very motivated on their job, which is sometimes surprising how realistic people are answering these questions. And the analysis was conducted with smart PLS, because it's, as you saw, it's a kind of a complex model. So linear regression is not really capturing all the variance in this model. Let's see. Now, the empirical findings are presented here. We have direct and indirect effects on corruptibility. the dark black lines with the arrows are the significant effects. So we do see that harm awareness is a strong preventive driver and reduces corruptibility. So if people know them taking that relatively small bribe will have societal consequences, they're less likely to do so. And we find that moral disengagement is a key driver of all what is going on. Interestingly, job-related burnout, despite the many studies that link it with morality, integrity, and performance at work, is not predictive of anything in here. Burnout as a state that maybe originated from high strain in work contexts is not related to corruptibility in the public sector. Public service motivation is, and social value orientation has a moderating role by increasing harm awareness, and then harm awareness is what reduces corruptibility. We have mixed results for the dark triad. Narcissism is not predictive, but psychopathy and Machiavellianism has an effect of how people even conceptualize that that corruption is a problem by the means of moral disengagement. So these relationships were emergent from the smart PLS model, which is interesting because it's not directed necessarily the way the theory suggested. So here we see in a summary the refined empirical demands resource model. As I mentioned, integrity draining demands may actually lead to more corruptibility at work via the dark triads and regulated by moral disengagement, which is a very important factor. And the integrity enhancing resources either work directly, public service motivation, or indirectly through the vehicle of harm awareness. Core insights, and I think also these are the central contributions of this study that are worth taking away. So this study provides basically a more holistic explanation of corruptibility as a process, and not just as a state or not just as a trait or something that is entirely driven by the institutions we work in or the organization. By introducing this job demands resource model of corruptibility, we kind of shift away from the bad apple explanations and more of a dynamic psychological process, a mechanism. In essence, corrupt behavior in public administration emerges from an interaction between integrity draining demands and integrity enhancing resources, specifically mediated by moral disengagement. And this is, I think, an important takeaway, also coming back to the questions we had at the beginning, because by reframing corruption as this dynamic process, we can actually manage it and design against it. For instance, through personal policies, by support networks. This study shows that you need to help people understand and not basically morally, disembark from the whole endeavor. This is more important than research has shown before. So we can do something regarding the organization environment, keeping people on board before they can check out morally, and should focus more on prevention than just sanctioning ex post. I do believe that compliance is still super important. You need to have clear rules for this, but preventative measures can also be effective. So Tola has a question.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is David. I'm from Osaka University. I I just want to know whether the sample, the sample you've taken is from a specific sector. Because by the literature shows that corruption can be different from sector to sector. For instance, how it's are they regulators or are they from law enforcement? I just want to know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, I didn't mention this. These participants are all from core administration, so they are not from street level policy or military or teaching or health. These are core bureaucrats working on different levels, local and federal level.
Okay.
Salome?
I lost it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. My name is Salome Flores. I work on the topic of measurement of corruption at the UNODC. Thank you for your presentation. Super, super interesting. I was just curious about the types of corruption that you included. I mean, you've been talking about administrative corruption, and then you have these three types. White, gray, and black, if I remember the colors correctly. And you were describing that rather than definitions, you presented scenarios. And I was curious to understand from you if your scenarios are covering the typical types of corruption. I mean, bribery, conflict of interest, abuse of function, trading and influence, illicit enrichment, the typical types of behaviors that have been criminalized in many countries. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Salome. These vignettes are quite extensive, and they basically capture all of the things you just mentioned, except direct trading of influence. Because this is often something that bureaucrats can also not directly offer, or only longitudinally. So you could summarize all of these scenarios as a form of bribery, in the sense of taking advantage that you are not due to, giving privilege for establishing a positive relation that is not in alignment with your office and the accountability you have. So it's a transition of different core values, and it's more of a scenario. The idea was that it's not that the core of this study is not testing different forms of corruption, like specific bribery and what the amount of the payment will do to the likelihood of corruption, or favoritism, nepotism. So it's more in the bucket of different forms of bribery, sometimes monetary, sometimes just taking advantage. So establishing a relationship between the briber and the bright bureaucrat. What?
For what? Please go ahead.
Thanks, Kristina, for the wonderful presentation. I'm Fuad Darwish from Egypt. I'm studying corruption, but especially the definition of corruption. So did you find within this study a new definition for corruption?
I would not go so far to claim I have a new definition of corruption for all types of corruption, but I think a conceptual innovation is in here. And it is that it is inherently a psychological and dynamic process that goes beyond a pure state or the trade. The bad apple kind of explains it as people are just bad. Some people are worse than others. And this study shows it's not as simple. And I think there is merit in looking at integrity outcomes as the outcome of this process. It's a longitudinal process that leads people to engage in corruption, be more likely to engage in corruption, which is really good, because then we can intervene all the time throughout this path. And maybe this is also like my humanistic approach to people. I don't think people are inherently bad. People tend to adapt very strongly to context and also to the states they find themselves in. So if we make sure to the environment. And some of the factors of environment are more plastic, more easily to change, while, for instance, culture is very long ingrained. Or if we have socially learned what is good behavior or what is acceptable behavior against what isn't, that's a long process to re-engineer. I do believe that looking at accountability is a good contemporary approach to defining corruption. The lack of office accountability, the mismatch between the accountability obligations that we have in an office and what is actually done. By the way, I brought some slides.
Another point here.
Yeah, sure.
There is a very enforceable or a powerful function that is the source of the power or the authority that the public worker take his authority from. Like if you are working on the parliament, so you get your authority from the parliament. If you're working on the police station, you are getting your authority from the interior ministry, and so on. This source is a very significant different factor on the appetite of corruption. I would suggest. Another point: have you been have the chance to read the writings of Danarelli?
Yes.
Yes, this book.
You have it. Yes.
Yes.
Honest truth about dishonesty.
It's very deep to this to your point, and there is some scenarios about the perceivedness of the person about the dishonesty. The book is The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and there is other books that touching the same points of your research. And he got to that points in a very dramatic way. I would suggest that you give it a better look in the future.
Thank you. Yes, I can also recommend Don Ariely's and colleagues' work published in some of the journals. They often do. They research a lot of dice games. You know, trying to find out when people lie, and then I would say, well, that's nice and dandy. We need these studies, but this is part of these foundations I talked about, and I think it's also good to take into account what people then do at work, because the conditions of what we've learned from our colleagues will also depend on whether we actually will lie or will actually take the bribe. So it's a bit of a more dynamic, systematic approach, I think. But this study is not the one and only. So more research is definitely needed.
It's very good effort, in fact, and I really congratulate you for it.
Thank you. Is it Vajda or Joseph? Next one.
Kinga, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity for my questions. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was extremely interesting. I'm from the Hungarian Integrity Authority, and I'm a leading research analyst there. And we are also preparing for a pretty similar research in the next month in the civil servant group. So my questions, according to this, and more or less to the methodological part of your data collection. You are talking about convenience sample, if I'm right, that you are collecting data with convenience sample, but it is representative. So how you can prepare or make representative data with this convenience sample? This is my first question, and I would like to ask that: do you only ask leaders from these institutions, or you collect data from every field from these civil servant institutions? And do you dealing with noble cause corruption? Because you mentioned that you are using vignette method. This is very interesting. We also use it and very useful. But do you dealing with or asking a kind of vignette that has a connection to noble cause corruption?
Thank you. Happy to answer this. I'll start with the last question, noble cause corruption. In this study, I didn't. This study was replicated in 15 countries, so you can only slice it up a little bit. So we're going to have some more follow-up research on that. I did a very similar study, not on noble cause corruption, but on pro-social rule breaking, which kind of goes into the same direction. And I would encourage you to look at some prior research if you want some inspiration for vignettes, because it's basically violation of basic rules of procedure, you know, the equity treatment of citizens for, well, likability and these kind of things. So you can do this with vignettes, and very well. If I would do the study today, I would maybe complement vignettes with a discrete choice experiment where you can systematically vary very distinct factors. that lead to noble cause corruption, because the problem in that is, well, people are not enriching themselves, but they still break rules, undermine the procedures, they violate equal treatment and so on, because in the end, we find that noble cause corruption happens for people who are, for instance, similar to the civil servants, or are more likable, or are more well prepared. You know, this whole deservingness aspect of that is kind of an integrity issue. And then, yes, it is possible to draft a representative sample from a convenient sampling approach. What we did is we found out the full the full overview of all email addresses of all active civil servants, and then we basically invited all of them. And this is why it's a convenient sample, because not everybody is responding. So we didn't use a panel provider, for instance. But then it turned out that the data, because it was large enough, still more or less represents the body of active civil servants. I would do it again, actually, because most civil servants are not part of these general purpose panel providers. So I think it's a good approach to just ask people and then check very diligently what kind of data you actually get. If you get many responses, what you can also do is draw random samples from this, and try to kind of reduce the raw data set that you'll receive, and find out, well, how can you make it more representative by then letting go of some of the observations. But this only works if you have a substantively large sample. Really excited to read your study. Interesting work. Joseph?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I had a question as well concerning the methodology that connects to the conceptual model. Just very briefly before doing that, I also wanted to bring attention to everyone to a paper I just shared via chat on the definition of corruption that Kristina was mentioning earlier about deficit of office accountability, which is something that Kristina Seva and colleagues have been working on for a few years. So I'm very happy to see more and more colleagues paying attention to it, because I think it's very interesting. My question was about how you manage the complexity of a survey design for this model with the necessity of reaching certain number of participants in the sample. Specifically, I'm thinking about moral disengagement here, right? Because on the one hand, you have for your dependent variable the vignettes. Vignettes are very rich, but also in that richness, it takes time for participants to go through them, right? Moral disengagement is a concept that has really made wave over the last 10-15 years, right? You mentioned more. Moral disengagement itself has different forms, right? It is very varied. It includes moral justification and advantage comparison, displacement of responsibility, etc., right? In the type of moral disengagement that the individual can engage in. And in that heterogeneity, researchers have even started kind of categorizing them by locus, right? Locus on the victim, or in agency, on the behavior itself, etc., etc. So my question is, when one of the concept itself is so rich that you can potentially include a battery of questions just to evaluate an individual's disposition towards moral disengagement, and then you have also other complex concepts. How do you manage to put all of that together within one measurement instrument or evaluation instrument in this case? So if you could share some insights about how that process looked like and what were the trade-offs.
Thank you. Indeed, I like these practical questions, and it is a challenge. So the study was pre-tested several times, took several rounds of also plausibility checks with involved experts from the field to make sure that it's not overburdening the survey participants. And first of all, yes, you do have the risk of having a slight overrepresentation of people who are not morally disengaged, who are pro-socially motivated, because these are the people who are more likely, taken from the general population, to actually finish a survey where they're not being directly paid or forced to do it. So what this also means is these findings that the model shows, and they're quite dramatic with the relationships that we find, and quite strong. These are the lower ceiling, like that. This is the bottom. It's very likely that the actual effects, if we had like a huge population sample, would even be stronger. So it actually adds to robustness. Now, practically, what you do is you have to separate the treatments from the capturing of these basic motivational, value orientation, and moral disengagement questions. Ideally, do use pre-validated scales, which we all did here. And sometimes there are short scales. Pre-test if you can make the scales shorter. And the moral disengagement one also, I think it has almost 20 items or so. Maybe that's just a bit too much. It's super important to pre-test whether these items, when asked at one point of the questionnaire, are kind of having halo effects or bleed into the responses. You can check this by doing a little bit of a pre-test with maybe 50 participants, for which you can actually use like a general purpose panel, and then test mathematically if there are patterns in this data, and it can show you that no, you need to put in a filler task, or you need to split it up, which makes it harder to reach these to actually get full responses. But sometimes it can make sense to ask people these basic motivational questions and moral disengagement and so on, or status of burnout, because this normally doesn't change through a couple of days. Do this in 1 week, and then send them a follow-up email invitation a week later with the actual treatment. So you can make sure that by having asked these motivational questions, you're not triggering pro-social response or negative response. You know, if you ask people about burnout at job and they have a very bad day, then maybe they may be more likely to say like, yeah, I'll take the bribe. So these kind of survey design considerations, I think best is to first ask experts whether what you're actually trying to do, especially with vignettes, does this make sense? Is this realistic? And also do test it while you actually raise the data, and make sure to not make it too long. People will show you if it's too long because they will just not finish the survey. But if you really, really need to have extensive batteries of questions, consider splitting it off. For this case now, for moral disengagement, we basically took a multiple locus, all-purpose scale. I think for follow-up research, I would take something that is more targeted, for instance, regarding the commitment to civil service, or like this service idea, because it is so ingrained also in the ethos, in the identities that these people have. Switzerland has a job-based position, so people can switch between public and private sector, but normally they stay for most of their career once they have joined the civil service, and they have a different motivation than private sector agents. All right.
Fantastic, thank you. That was very insightful. And I also realized we have held you on this slide for quite some time, so please.
Not a problem. We are basically wrapping up, and I'm very glad that you found it interesting to have some questions. The second biggest contribution is that moral disengagement is really important. We talked about this before, and I think the key takeaway here is that people are, as our data show, not necessarily corrupt because they lack some kind of morals or moral conviction, but because context, traits, and states interact and then enable them to find moral license to engage in these acts of corruption. So I think this is very interesting, and moral licensing in general, particularly also the paradox effects, you know, people can like talk themselves into moral licensing from prior moral acts. This demands more research in the future. Let me see if I can still switch this here. Third, dark triad is not as powerful as we think. Yes, we do see some effects of these Machiavellian and psychopathic traits, but let's be honest, I think the whole discourse is a little bit overblown, given that first, the incidence rate within the general population is rather low. And I think narcissism particularly has no measurable effect in our data, even though we've controlled for the size and the prevalence and so on. It's often associated with unethical leadership. We do not see this. And I'll just remember, in a previous question, I had the question about did the sample include only leaders or followers? We have both. We have leaders and followers, but given that we started with a convenient sampling, we don't have the structure. So we don't know whether we have both the leaders and the followers of one team, but we just control whether they have leadership responsibility, and it is not predictive. So we also controlled for age, gender, education, and also leadership position, and it doesn't really explain corruptibility more. Then interesting, especially for the public management and public personal administration discourse, is there's a difference between how public service motivation and the general purpose social value orientation works, because there's been a decades-long decade of what is public service motivation different than these value-based convictions. And the data and the model shows that PSM works distinctly because PSM, but not social value orientation, increases harm awareness, which is good. So apparently it's a cognitive resource that makes people more sensitive to societal damage of corruption, and thereby we have identified a cognitive emotional mechanism between PSM and corruptibility. In contrast, social value orientation is also good, but it reduces moral disengagement itself. And I mean, it is associated with reducing moral disengagement itself. So it's a more direct resource for more integrity. The study therefore shows there's multiple bright side traits that can protect integrity and use different cognitive psychological ways. This is interesting for anti-corruption design and integrity trainings, because you could actually make distinct courses that grow these convictions and the value orientation awareness trainings. So rather than having one size fits all showing the harmfulness of corruption, maybe focus on these more integrity related sort of value orientation and public service motivation insights. As I mentioned, very surprising, burnout does not increase corruptibility. My interpretation is that people who are actually affected by burnout, which is horrible, are kind of in a lock-in situation. So they are neither more or less corrupt because they are just missing the energy to do something from it. Also, there's no link between the job-related burnout and moral disengagement, which is interesting because HR research sometimes suggests that people who are burnt out will also lose their morals. This is not the case. Moral convictions are very strong. Harm awareness is strong. And people are not morally engaged because they are psychological and physically drained. So maybe we need a bit more compassion for the people who suffer this. And this finding also redirects some attention to anti-corruption trainings towards more ethical reasoning than focusing on emotional exhaustion. And then lastly, we found that traits and states interact. So this supports a behavioral micro-level approach to public sector integrity management. And the study also bridges this long-standing debate between trait and state, personality and context-based explanations towards a more holistic, synthetic, process-based idea of what constitutes corruptibility. So it's an interaction of relatively stable traits and plastic, malleable psychological states mediated by what are the actual work conditions and moral cognition. So integrity outcomes are neither based on fixed bad apple ideas or fully situational. It's a conditionally stable concept that also hopefully informs a more sophisticated idea of designing anti-corruption and anchoring around the core of moral disengagement. That was my presentation. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Kristina. I mean, this was so extremely insightful and not just academically, but at the same time, it's very easy to see the real world applications that you were talking in terms of designing more impactful anti-corruption strategies in terms of training. I imagine that there's a lot of following up to do moving forward. but this is a fantastic line of research, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to share these results with us. And I cannot speak for the rest, although I'm sure that they will agree with this. But you have given me so much to think about. I was taking notes throughout the presentation, and yeah. Eh, I apologize in advance in case there are other questions or comments. I already see Raimunda's hand waiting up. Unfortunately, again, we have only allocated 60 minutes to this presentation. Maybe next time I'll have to see about leaving some leeway at the very end. So Raimundas, I owe you a few minutes for your question next during the next webinar event.
Okay, Joseph, thank you. I'm very happy that you organize some professional event. It may be, it will be not a question, but it's a remark. Thank you, Kristina, for wonderful presentation. It is very close to my research interest. My name is Raimundas Kalastikas. I'm professor, and currently I'm lead researcher on anti-corruption, public integrity, and governance. And I'm doing research in the Central Asia countries. Currently, I'm located in the Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and my research focusing what you are start to speak about micro level. I mean how this some decision making or autocratic or bureaucratic corruptions influence this administrative corruptions. But it's my research is interact with the macro realities of the legal diffusion regulatory framework. I mean, rule of law reforms and public administration reforms. And my reactions and my questions, what I recognize in my research, and what I would like to ask you comment. You know, this today is very important. There are some boundaries of the conduct and approach of the tolerance to the corruptions in the public administration. I mean that what I see from your presentations, there are some acceptable and unacceptable behavior, or right or wrong, which are usually fixed in the ethical code of the ethics or code of the ethical conduct. And this behavioral traps created by administrative acts and managerial oversight failures. And what is the research paradigm focus on that level? What leads individual who are work in the public administration area to become involved into the corruption? I mean, what is the factors influencing our decisions and which behavioral model to choose? I mean that persons need to perceive or identify the case situation. For example, everywhere is fixed. Gifts is forbidden to take in the duty service, but he needs to know to make decisions or to take actions and in reality behave if he sees misconduct of other colleagues. And my questions, does your research analyze these connections between acceptable and unacceptable behavior through this management oversight mechanism within the public administration organization?
If you both will allow me to interrupt, because I need to close the event now, I will be happy to connect you both via email, if that is okay, Kristina, so that we can continue the conversation that way. Great.
I can answer with one sentence, and that
please, of course.
This study doesn't, but another study of mine that's called Blinded by the Light, it's currently a preprint, shows exactly this. And the short answer is, what is acceptable behavior, irrespective of what is written in the rules, will always be socially constructed. People figure it out, and they will learn it, and they also construct what is corrupt and how they police corruption. So that's the short answer.
Great.
Okay, in the future we'll keep the contact on that issue to discuss.
Well, thank you again, Kristina, for donating your time to this for this presentation. Thank you, everyone, for joining this first meeting of this new webinar, and I'll keep you up to date on the next events. All right, and hope to see you all again very, very soon. Have a wonderful day.
Joseph.
Thank you, Kristina. Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye.